Welcome, seekers of forgotten lore, to our Heart of Shadows. Here we peel back the skin of history to reveal the bone and gristle of the tales that truly haunt us. Tonight we journey into the soil of the old country, to a fear older than the mountains, a fear of what comes after. You think you know the vampire, the elegant count in his castle? That is a fiction, a comfortable lie. The truth is something far more intimate, far more brutal. It is the fear of the neighbor who does not rest, the family member who returns with malice in their heart. So I ask you, what could drive an entire community to commit the ultimate sacrilege, to dig up their own dead, not to mourn but to hunt? Let me know your initial thoughts in the comments below. As we descend into this tale of the Strigoi, remember to like this video if you value these old stories, and subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a journey into the dark. And finally, tell us, what other myths, what other monsters do you want us to unearth next? Now settle in. The night is long, and the dead are stirring.
In the soil of the old country, there is a fear older than the mountains. A fear worse than death itself. It is the fear of what comes after, the fear of the unquiet dead, the neighbor who does not rest, the family member who returns. This is not a scene of mourning. There are no tears here, only resolve. The tools are not for burial, but for unburial, a desperate act of violation against the most sacred of grounds. For these people are not here to pay their respects. They are here to hunt a monster that they themselves have created. This is not the elegant aristocratic vampire of fiction, is not a creature of faraway castles and noble bloodlines. This is something older, more intimate, and far more terrifying. This is the world of the Strigoi. What could drive a community to commit such a desperate act, to violate a grave in the dead of night? To perform the solemn ritual meant to give the unquiet dead their final rest. To understand, we must go back to a time before the church bells rang, back to the primeval forests and the ancient beliefs that taught them that the soul never truly leaves, and that death was not always the end. Before the cross, before the legions of Rome, recorded history. The story of this land begins in the deep dark forests of the Carpathian Mountains. This was the world of the ancient Dacians and their ancestors, a world where the forest was not just a collection of trees but the first and most sacred temple, a living, breathing entity filled with power, mystery, and spirits. Theirs was an animistic worldview. They believed that everything possessed a soul, a spirit that had to be respected and feared. The rivers had their temperaments. The mountains had their moods, and the great beasts of the forest, the bear, the stag, and especially the wolf, were seen not just as animals but as powerful spiritual beings, physical manifestations of the untamable forces of nature. In this world, the human soul was not believed to depart for a distant heaven or hell upon death. It was seen as a part of the natural landscape itself. A lingering presence remained tied to the land, to the family, and to the memory of its own life. A soul could wander the forests it once knew, visit the homes it once occupied, and continue to interact with the world of the living. When Christianity eventually arrived in these mountains, these ancient, deeply rooted beliefs did not simply vanish. They went underground. They blended and fused with the new faith, creating a unique and complex tapestry of belief. The old spirits of the forest would eventually be given the new names of demons, and the ancient fear of the wandering, restless soul would provide the fertile ground for one of Europe's most enduring legends to grow. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, spoke of the peoples who lived in this land. He called the Dacians the most valiant and just of all the tribes, but he also wrote of their strange and intense beliefs around death, beliefs that reveal a culture with a unique and impermeable boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. At the heart of their faith was the figure of Zalmoxis, a legendary prophet, or god who taught them that they did not truly die. Instead, Herodotus tells us, they believed their souls simply went to Zalmoxis, achieving a kind of boisterous immortality. This was not a quiet, peaceful afterlife. It was a continuation of existence in the presence of their god. This core belief that the dead are not truly gone would become a deep and enduring feature of the region's psyche. This belief in immortality had a dark and ritualistic side. Herodotus describes a ceremony performed every 5 years, in which the Dacians would send a messenger to their god. A volunteer would be chosen, told the needs of the people, and then thrown with great force onto the points of 3 sharp spears. If he died instantly, the message was considered delivered and the gods were pleased. If he survived, he was shamed as a wicked man and another was chosen in his place. This intense, violent, and ritualized relationship with death reveals a worldview where the veil between worlds was not just thin. It could be torn open with a spear. When Christianity later arrived, this ancient cultural DNA did not disappear. The belief that the soul does not truly leave and the idea that the dead can be forcefully sent on a journey provided a powerful foundation for the later folklore. The immortal followers of Zalmoxis cast a long shadow, a shadow that would one day become the unquiet dead, the Strigoi.
In the old world of the Romanian countryside, it was believed that the border between the living and the dead was thin, porous, and that a person's fate could be sealed, not by the life they lived, but by the strange circumstances of their birth. To be born on a certain day, or in a certain way, was to be marked, to be set apart from the very beginning. The most famous and feared of these omens was to be born with the call. A call is a harmless and rare piece of the amniotic sac that sometimes covers a newborn's head like a delicate veil, a simple quirk of biology. But in the world of folklore, its meaning was far more sinister. It was seen as a fragment of a shroud from the other world, a sign that the child was born with 1 foot already in the grave, and destined to one day return from it. The moments after such a birth were fraught with peril. A crucial ritual had to be performed by the midwife. If the call was removed improperly, it was believed that the child might accidentally swallow a piece of it. Should this happen, its dark destiny was sealed. There was nothing more to be done. The child would become a Strigoi. To prevent this fate, the midwife had to carefully remove the membrane, dry it, and protect it. Sometimes it was destroyed, other times it was kept as a protective talisman, but from that moment on, the child's life was lived under a shadow. They were watched by the village with a mixture of pity and suspicion, a constant unspoken fear of what they were and what they one day become. The call was not the only omen to be feared. At the moment of birth, in the deep logic of folklore, numbers themselves held an immense power, and no number was more potent or more dangerous than the number 7. It was widely believed that a 7th son born in an unbroken line of 7s was destined for a supernatural life. This child was often thought to possess unique gifts, the power of second sight or the ability to heal certain illnesses. But this power came at a terrible price for it. It was believed that the 7th son was born with a second soul, often in the form of animal spirit, and while this granted them special abilities in life, it doomed them in death upon their passing. It was this restless second soul that was destined to rise from the grave and become a Strigoi like the child born with the call. The 7th son was thus set apart from the community. Gift was also their curse, and they would live their entire lives under a cloud of fear and suspicion. Every misfortune that befell a neighbor, every animal that sickened could potentially be laid at their door, for in the minds of the villagers they were already half in, half out of the natural world. living a life that was merely a prelude to the unnatural one that would surely follow. But a person's dark fate was not always sealed by an omen at birth. It could also be determined by the sins or even the simple neglect of their parents in a devoutly Christian society. The rite of baptism was as essential for the salvation and protection of a soul. An unbaptized child who died was considered to be in a state of spiritual limbo, their soul unable to find rest in heaven and dangerously vulnerable to being claimed by evil forces. And returning as a Strigoi, this spiritual vulnerability also extended to social standing. A child born out of wedlock was seen as living proof of a mortal sin. They carried the stain of their parents' transgression throughout their lives, often treated as outsiders by the tight-knit village community. This social stigma could easily curdle into superstitious suspicion. Such a child, already considered to be living outside the bounds of God's law, was a natural candidate for the dark destiny of the Strigoi. And so the community would watch a child could be marked by a physical sign like the call by a fateful number, like 7, or by the perceived stain of soul, from the circumstances of their birth, from their first breath. They were set apart, living a life under a cloud of dread, a life where every action, every word, every glance was scrutinized for a sign of the darkness that was believed to fester within the dread surrounding a marked child, not fade. As they grew, it festered, for in Romanian folklore the threat of the Strigoi was not something that only began after death. There was also the Strigoi view, the living Strigoi. These individuals were not seen as monsters in human form, but as living people, witches and warlocks who possess dark powers and a malevolent spirit. They were your neighbor, your cousin, the quiet woman at the end of the lane, and their envy or ill will.
A dark destiny was not always sealed at birth. A person could live an entirely unremarkable life, free from any supernatural sign or suspicion, only to be doomed by the very manner of their death. For in the folkloric worldview there was a profound difference between a good death and a bad death. Good death meant dying in one's bed, surrounded by family, having received the last rites of the church. A soul that departed this way was at peace, but a bad death was one that violated the natural order of things. The most feared of these was death by suicide. To take one's own life was seen as a rejection of God's gift, a final act of despair that left the soul in a state of profound turmoil and sin. Such a person was denied burial in the hallowed ground of the churchyard. They were often interred at a crossroads outside the village limits. Their unhallowed grave was a gateway, and the restless, tormented soul was considered almost certain to return with malevolence. Other violent or unnatural death were also feared. A person who was murdered, whose life was ripped away before its time, might return, seeking vengeance. A traveler who died in an accident far from home and without burial rites might become a wandering spirit. And a person who died while under the curse of another witch or Strigoi was believed to be infected, destined to rise and continue the chain of evil. But perhaps the most intimate threat came from a death fueled by earthly passion. A person died with a deep and bitter grudge in their heart, one who felt they had been wronged by their family or cheated by their neighbors, could not pass peacefully into the next world. It was believed their powerful malevolent will would remain bound to their corpse, reanimating it so they could crawl from the grave to seek a final terrible revenge on those who they felt had betrayed them in life. In the traditions of Eastern Europe, death did not mark an instantaneous departure. The soul was believed to linger for 40 days, journeying through the places it knew in life, before facing its final judgment. For a peaceful soul, this was a sacred procession, but for a troubled or cursed soul, this was a period of immense danger,
a window of time where it could lose its way and become trapped between worlds. The living therefore were on high alert. A constant vigil was kept over the body before burial to ensure it did not stir. Mirrors in the house were covered so the wandering soul would not see its own reflection and be trapped. Clocks were sometimes stopped to symbolically halt time for the deceased. Every ritual was designed to help the soul on its journey and to protect the living from a potential unwelcome return. The burial rites themselves were filled with a kind of sacred paranoia. If there was any suspicion that the deceased might become a Strigoi, specific powerful precautions were taken. A stone or coin might be placed in the mouth to prevent it from chewing on its own. Shroud, a sure sign of vampirism. Sometimes the body would be buried face down, so that if it tried to dig its way out, it would only dig deeper into the earth. And for the most feared cases, more extreme measures were used. A nail might be driven through the skull or a sickle, a tool for harvesting from the fields, would be placed around the neck, a final grim insurance policy meant to sever the head from the body if the corpse ever tried to rise. These were passed after the prayers were said and all the rituals were performed. A strange sickness still plagued the family if the cattle still wasted away, if a ghostly figure was still seen haunting the edges of the village. Then the community knew their worst fears had been realized. The transformation was complete. The Strigoi view was gone, and the Strigoi mort, the undead, had taken its place. The rituals have failed. The soul has not found its peace. Deep beneath the earth, something stirs, not with the spark of life, but with a cold and hungry memory of it. It pushes through the soil of violation, God's earth, and stands once more under the moon. No longer a person, it is now a vessel for a relentless, singular purpose, to return the Strigoi mort. The undead does not wander aimlessly. It is drawn by the invisible threads of its former life. It moves through the sleeping village, an unseen shadow passing houses it once knew. It is pulled not by a love for its home, but by a twisted predatory instinct, a need to revisit the source of the life it has lost. Its first destination is almost always its own home. It does not rattle the latch or break down the door. It seeps through the keyhole, the chimney, or the cracks in the wall. It enters the room where its family sleeps, a silent, suffocating presence. It stands over the beds of its wife, its children, its brothers, the very people who just mourned its passing, and then it acts. The first attack is often not a violent bite, but a draining of life. The sleeper feels a great weight on their chest, a paralysis, the feeling of their breath being stolen away, or they feel a single icy touch that leaves a small unexplained bruise. They awake in the morning feeling weak, drained, and deeply inexplicably cold. The haunting has begun.
The Strigoi's malevolence was not confined to the walls of its former home. It was believed to radiate outwards, a source of blight upon the entire community. When a mysterious sickness began to pass from one house to another, with no discernible cause, when people grew weak and wasted away, the villagers looked not for a natural cause, but a supernatural one. Their first suspicion would fall upon the most recent grave, in the churchyard, in a world without any knowledge of germ theory. A sudden epidemic was a terrifying and inexplicable event. The concept of the Strigoi as a plague bearer offered both an explanation and, more importantly, an enemy. It was believed the undead creature could spread disease simply with its presence, or by ringing the church bells at midnight. blaming a Strigoi transformed a random invisible pestilence into a tangible foe that could be hunted and destroyed. The supernatural blight extended to the land itself. The Strigoi, having rejected the natural order of life and death, brought chaos to nature. They could tie the rains, causing devastating droughts that would parch the fields and kill the livestock. They could summon hailstorms in the middle of summer to shatter the harvest. The very livelihood of the village, its ability to feed itself, was now at the mercy of the monster in its midst. And so the haunting of a single family became a curse upon the whole community. The Strigoi was no longer a private sorrow. It was a public enemy, a cancer at the heart of the village, that threatened the health of their children, the lives of their cattle, and the success of their harvest. The stakes had been raised from a personal tragedy to a fight for collective survival, and the community knew it had to act. While the Strigoi was a threat to the entire village, its first and most intimate victims were always its own kin. The creature was drawn back to the people and places it knew, and its haunting was a terrible, twisted continuation of the bonds of family. The greatest danger was not to a stranger in a distant house, but to the wife, child, the sibling sleeping in the bed it once called its own. The assault began in the mind. Family members would be plagued by vivid and terrifying night terrors. They would dream of their deceased loved one, who would appear before them, not as a blessed memory, but as a tormenting specter. Would feel a crushing weight on their chest, a sense of paralysis, or the horrifying sensation of being suffocated in their sleep by an unseen presence. They would awake, exhausted, terrified, and drenched in a cold sweat. These psychological torments were accompanied by a visible physical decline. Family members closest to the deceased would begin to waste away. They grew pale and listless. They lost their appetite. Their strength seemed to vanish, for no discernible reason. It was as if their very life force was being siphoned off, night after night, by the thirsty spirit of their departed relative. This placed the family in a terrible, impossible position. They were the first to know the horrifying truth. But how could they accuse their own husband, their own father, their own child of being a monster? Their grief and their lingering love for the person who once was battled with instinct for survival. This hesitation, this secrecy born of love and fear, often allowed the haunting to grow stronger, festering within the walls of the family home, until the evidence became too overwhelming for the rest of the village. To ignore the quiet suffering of the haunted family would not remain a secret for long. In the tight-knit world of a village, there were no secrets. Neighbors were always watching, always listening, and when a family began to wither after a recent death, the community knew what signs to look for. They looked for physical proof that the dead was unquiet. Place they looked was the grave itself. It was believed that a Strigoi had to leave a small hole in the earth, to breathe or to allow its spirit to pass. Finding such holes on a grave was considered undeniable proof. Animals were also seen as reliable detectors of the supernatural. It was a horse would shy and refuse to pass over the grave of a Strigoi, and a dog would not approach it, instead growling at the unhallowed ground from a distance. The evidence would also appear in the village. People would report seeing the ghostly figure of the recently deceased, walking the paths, and strange, inexplicable noises would be heard coming from the afflicted family's home. And most damning of all, there might be physical tracks, a line of footprints in the morning mud, or fresh snow leading directly from the cemetery to the door of the haunted house, and then back again, with a kind of mounting evidence. The private tragedy of a single family would become a public crisis. The whispers in the village would turn into open discussion, and then into firm conviction. The community was now sure of the source of their troubles. The burden of proof was no longer on the Terra family. The responsibility to act now rested on the shoulders of the entire village.
an action that would inevitably bring their ancient folk beliefs into direct conflict with the official powers of the church and state. The village was now convinced. The evidence was undeniable. The fear was palpable. There was a monster in their graveyard, a Strigoi from among their own, and it was threatening the lifeblood of their community. A consensus was reached. The body had to be exhumed, and the creature had to be destroyed, and for such a grave and sacred task, they turned to the highest authority they knew, their village priest. The delegation would have approached him with the utmost seriousness. They would present their evidence, the wasting sickness of the family, the strange holes in the earth, the cattle that gave no milk. They would implore him as the shepherd of their flock to lead them to the grave, to perform the necessary rites, and to give the unquiet soul its final peace. From their perspective, this was not a desecration. It was a holy duty. But here the village's ancient folk beliefs often slammed into the rigid wall of official church doctrine. The priest was caught in an impossible position. As a man who had grown up in the village, he may have shared their fears. He may have believed in the Strigoi himself. But as a man of the cloth, he answered to a higher power, a theological system that condemned these practices as pagan superstition. To the educated bishops and church authorities, cities, digging up corpses and mutilating them was a barbaric relic of a pre-Christian past. The official position was clear. The sacraments of the church, prayer, confession, holy water, were the only legitimate weapons against evil. The priest's duty was to calm the flock, to reinforce their faith in God, and to forbid them from taking part in what he was bound to call a devilish ritual. This refusal would often create a crisis. The villagers, already terrified of the monster, now felt abandoned by the very institution meant to protect them. Their pleas would turn to anger, their fear to desperation. Many documented cases, when the priest refused to help, the villagers decided to take matters into their own hands, proceeding with the exhumation without the church's blessing, creating a deep and bitter rift within the community, a panic that was now spiraling out of control. The clash between ancient folklore and modern authority came to a head in the early 18th century as the Austrian Habsburg Empire expanded into the Balkans. Their rational bureaucratic officials were suddenly confronted with local beliefs that defied all reasonable explanation. One of the first and most famous of official encounters took place in the year 1725 in the small Serbian village of Kiselova. The story began simply. A peasant named Petar Blagojevic died and was buried, but within 10 days a mysterious sickness swept through the village, claiming 9 more lives. The victims on their deathbeds all told the same terrifying story, that Petar Blagojevic had come to them in the night, throttled them, and drained them of life. The village was seized by a collective panic. The villagers, including Petar's own widow, who claimed to have seen his ghost, refused to let any more people die. They demanded local imperial administrator, an official named Frumbald, authorized the immediate exhumation and ritualistic destruction of Petar's body. According to their ancient customs, Frumbald was a man of the Enlightenment caught in a pre-modern nightmare. He was deeply reluctant to authorize what he saw as a barbaric and superstitious act, but he was also faced with the village on the brink of a full-blown riot. Fearing for his own life, he agreed to be present, and his official report sent back to Vienna became a sensation in dry bureaucratic prose. He documented the exhumation. He noted with astonishment that the body of Petar Blagojevic, weeks after death, was not decomposed. He recorded the villagers' claims that its hair and nails had grown. He described seeing fresh liquid blood on the corpse's mouth, and he reported that when the villagers drove a sharpened stake through the body's heart, a prodigious quantity of fresh blood erupted from the wound, and from its mouth. This strange and clinical report, describing an impossible event, began to circulate among the curious intellectuals of Vienna. It was a single unsettling tremor from the dark edge of the empire. That single tremor would save him an earthquake. for it was a second, even more dramatic case. A few years later that would turn the quiet fascination of scholars into a full-blown public hysteria across the continent. The case centered on a former soldier named Arnold Pila, who had recently moved to the Serbian village Inta. Had a strange story. He confessed to his neighbors that while serving in Greece, he had been tormented by a vampire but had cured himself by eating soil from the vampire's grave and smearing himself with its blood. In 1727, Pila died after falling from a hay wagon. A month later, people claimed he was haunting the village, and several soon died following their custom. The villagers exhumed Pila's body. They found it to be perfectly uncorrupted with fresh blood on its lips. They staked him through the heart, burned the body to ash, and threw the ashes in his grave. Story did not end there. The villagers believed Pila had not only attacked people but had also fed on their cattle. They reasoned that anyone who later ate the meat from this tainted livestock would also be infected. So when a new wave of deaths struck the village 5 years later and conclusion was reached, a second generation of vampires had been created. The panic was now absolute. This time the imperial authorities in Vienna dispatched a full commission led by a senior army surgeon, Johannes Flickinger. His task was to conduct a thorough medical investigation and put an end to the vampire affair once and for all. His team would go on to exhume 13 bodies from the village graveyard. Flickinger's final report is one of the most extraordinary documents of the Enlightenment writing. With the cool, detached language of a modern surgeon, he meticulously documents the signs of vampirism. In case after case, he describes bodies found completely undecayed with skin and nails, fresh in chests, filled with liquid blood. He notes how, upon being staked, the bodies would emit a great groan and bleed profusely, as if they were still alive. This detailed clinical and scientific report of the supernatural, signed by a team of imperial surgeons, was a bombshell. It was translated, published, and debated in journals and salons across Europe. Philosophers like Voltaire wrote about it. Theologians argued over it. The humble folkloric Strigoi of Romania, filtered through the rational lens of an Austrian military surgeon's report, had become an international celebrity. A documented monster for the age of reason and the direct ancestor of the creature that would one day conquer the world's imagination.
The village was now ready to act, but they faced a critical problem. The hauntings and sickness pointed to a Strigoi, but in a village where several people might have died in a season, how could they be sure which grave held the monster? Exhuming every recent grave was an unthinkable act of mass sacrilege. They needed a way to pinpoint their target with supernatural certainty. For this, they turned not to a priest, but to the world of nature, and to a creature believed to be deeply sensitive to the presence of evil: a horse. The folk belief was simple. An animal of pure spirit could detect an unholy one. The horse had to be of a pure color, either jet black or snow white, with not a single spot of another color on its coat. The ritual was a solemn and terrifying procession. A young boy, often a virgin, to ensure his own purity, would mount the horse. He would then guide the animal slowly through the graveyard, weaving between the crooked tombstones and sunken mounds of earth. The villagers would follow in intense silence, their lanterns and torches casting long dancing shadows as the horse was led, one by one, over the grave of every person who had died in recent memory. Over most graves, the horse would pass without incident, but the villagers watched its every step, its every twitch of its ears. Then, as it approached the grave of the true Strigoi, its instinct would take over it. It would stop dead in its tracks, digging its hooves into the earth, refusing to be led forward. Often it would rear up, its eyes wide with a terror that no human could see but all could understand. This was the sign the pure beast
had found the unholy one. The target had been identified with the grave, now marked by supernatural means. The final taboo had to be broken, an act that would under any normal circumstances be a mortal sin. The desecration of a grave now became a sacred and necessary duty. Under the cover of darkness, the men of the village, their hearts filled with a mixture of terror and grim resolve, would take up their shovels and they would begin to dig. The work was hard and the air was thick with dread. The only sound would be the scrape of shovels against stone, and the heavy breathing of the men, until finally a dull thud echoed from the bottom of the pit. They had struck the coffin with ropes and raw strength. The heavy wooden box would be heaved from the earth, and laid upon the ground. This was the moment of ultimate truth. The entire village would gather around, as the village elder or the bravest among them would pry the lid from the coffin. A final prayer would be said, a final breath would be held, and the lid would be lifted, revealing the secrets that lay within. What they saw inside would either confirm their worst fears or throw them into even deeper confusion, for the body of a Strigoi does not look like the body of a normal man. When the lid was finally lifted, the villagers were looking for a very specific set of signs, evidence that would confirm their fears. First, and most important sign was the state of the body itself. In a world with no concept of modern embalming, a body weeks or even months after death should be in a state of decay. But the corpse of a Strigoi was different. It was believed to be incorrupt. The body would not be skeletal or wasted, strangely preserved. It might even appear plumper, healthier than it was at the moment of death. The limbs would not be stiff with rigor mortis, but supple and flexible. The face would have a ruddy, lifelike complexion, not the pale waxen mask of a normal corpse. To the terrified villagers, this was a miracle. It was a curse, a sign that the body was not truly dead, but was being unnaturally preserved by a malevolent force. A force that was nourishing itself on the stolen vitality of the living. They would look for other signs. Often the eyes of the corpse would be found wide open, staring up from the coffin. Its hair and fingernails would appear to have grown since burial. And most damning of all, they would look for the presence of fresh liquid blood on the lips, in the mouth, or pooled at the bottom of the coffin. This was seen as the ultimate proof that the creature had been secretly leaving the grave to feed. Sometimes they would find the burial shroud. The simple cloth wrapped around the body had been chewed on from the inside. This was considered a particularly horrifying sign, a belief that the Strigoi in its hunger would begin by consuming its own grave clothes before moving on to consume the life of its family. All of these signs, viewed through the lens of folklore, painted a single undeniable picture. This was not their husband, not their father, not their neighbor. This was a monster, a parasitic shell, animated by a hungry spirit. The time for doubt was over. The evidence was before them, plain to see. And there was only one thing left to do. The verdict has been delivered by the evidence in the coffin. The community gathered around the open grave now had to perform the final terrible rites. This was the second killing, a ritual designed not just to destroy a body, but to annihilate soul. The most famous of these acts, known across the world, was the driving of a stake through the creature's heart. This was not a random act of violence. The material of the stake was crucial. It had to be made from a specific type of wood, often ash, hawthorn, or wild rose, all of which were believed to have powerful sacred properties that could harm the undead. The stake was meant to physically pin the corpse to the earth, preventing it from ever rising again, while also releasing the tormented malevolent spirit that was trapped within. Often staking alone was not considered enough to finish the job. To be absolutely certain, the villagers would then decapitate the corpse, usually with the sharp edge of a shovel. This was seen as the definitive way to sever the connection between the animating spirit and its physical vessel. The severed head was then often placed between the feet, or buried far from the body to ensure it could never be rejoined. Other grim precautions were taken. Cloves of garlic would be stuffed into the mouth of the corpse to prevent the spirit from speaking curses or calling for aid from the other world, and the body would sometimes be turned face down in the coffin, so that some semblance of life were to return. It would only dig itself deeper into the earth, away from the world of the living. But the ultimate purification, the ultimate destruction, came from fire. The heart, believed to be the physical seat of the creature's unnatural life, would be cut from the chest. Grotesque trophy would be taken to a crossroads at midnight and burned on a pyre until it was reduced to nothing but fine black ash, with the body pinned and mutilated, and its heart destroyed by fire. The physical monster was now finally gone. The destruction of the Strigoi's heart by fire was not the end of the ritual. It was the creation of the final ingredient for the cure. The fine black ash was carefully collected from the embers by the village elder, or the head of the afflicted family. This ash, the last remnant of the monster's power, was then mixed with clean water, often drawn from the village. Well, this curative draught was then taken back to the haunted home. It was given to all the family members who had been suffering from the wasting sickness, the night terrors, and the mysterious decline in the logic of folk magic. This was the only true antidote. By ingesting the very essence, the creature that had been draining their life, the curse would be broken, and their stolen vitality would be returned to them, with the monster's body pinned, its heart destroyed, and its victims healed by its own ashes. The natural order was finally restored. The haunting was over. The community faced down the ultimate terror. A loved one returned with malice and had triumphed through the power of their ancient shared rituals. The physical threat was gone, but the memory of the monster and the reasons for its creation would linger forever. The hunt is over. The monster is destroyed, and the village is safe. But as we look back from the safety of the modern world, we can ask a deeper question. What was the real monster the villagers were fighting? Perhaps the Strigoi was never just a creature, but a diagnosis, a way for a pre-scientific society to give a face to the random, terrifying, invisible forces that governed their lives. Consider the classic symptoms of a Strigoi victim: a slow wasting sickness, a persistent cough, a pale complexion, a gradual draining of all life. This is a perfect folkloric description of one of the great historical scourges of Europe: tuberculosis, consumption. When this highly contagious disease spread through a single family, killing one member after another, it would have looked exactly like a supernatural haunting. The belief in a vampire returning to feed on its kin was a way to explain the brutal reality of contagion. The legend also provided a powerful outlet for the complex, messy reality of human grief. Why does the Strigoi almost always attack its own family? Perhaps because the deepest resentments, the most painful guilt, and the most bitter words are often found within the family itself. A father who died with a grudge, who felt wronged, a brother who was cheated of his inheritance. These were powerful, unresolved social traumas. The ritual of the second killing can then be seen as a kind of terrible necessary catharsis, a final violent severing of a toxic family tie by declaring the abusive father or the resentful brother
A monster. The family gave themselves permission to destroy his memory, to purify themselves of his influence, and to finally move on. The ritual wasn't just about killing a corpse. It was about killing a painful memory. The legend of the Strigoi then is a dark mirror. It is a story that village told themselves to make sense of a world filled with disease, famine, and the profound pain of loss. It is a story about how sometimes it is easier to blame a monster that can be staked and burned than it is to confront the real-life sorrows for which there is no simple cure. The world that created Strigoi is gone. Science has explained the diseases that once seemed like a supernatural curse. The rituals of the stake and the pyre have given way to modern medicine and law in modern Romania. The literal belief in the undead rising from the grave has faded into the past, but the story itself has died. It has simply transformed. The echo of the Strigoi still lingers. It lives on in the folk traditions of rural communities, in the ghost stories told to children on winter nights, in the continued custom of hanging garlic for good luck on St. Andrew's Eve. It has become intertwined with the glow myth of Dracula, a powerful force for tourism and a key part of Romania's national brand. The creature is no longer a source of terror, but a cherished and carefully preserved piece of cultural inheritance. But the story of how this folkloric creature was transformed into the world's most famous monster is a tale for another time. Every culture has its monsters. They are the maps of our oldest fears, the records of our deepest traumas, and the Strigoi is more than a simple vampire. It is a memory in the blood of the land. A story that speaks of the hardship of life, the fear of contagion, complexities of grief, and the profound desperate need to find answers for the suffering that has no name. It is a whisper from the unquiet dead, a dark and beautiful piece of folklore that tells us less about the monsters that hide in the grave and more about the ones that hide in the human heart. Thank you for watching.
The primary power attributed to the living Strigoi was a kind of psychic vampirism. It was believed they could steal the mana or life essence from the world around them. They could steal the milk from a neighbor's cow, leaving it dry. They could steal the fertility from a field, causing the crops to wither, and they could steal the very strength and vitality from a healthy person, leaving them weak and listless, all without laying a single hand on them. This belief made them the perfect scapegoat for the harsh realities of rural life. When a drought struck, it was because a Strigoi had tied rains. When a hailstorm destroyed the harvest, it was the work of a Strigoi. They were the living embodiment of misfortune, a human face for the inexplicable cruelties of nature and fate. But their most fantastic power was revealed while they slept. It was believed that on certain powerful nights of the year, like the eve of St. Andrew or St. George, the spirit of a living Strigoi could leave their physical body behind. This detachable soul, often taking the form of an animal, was then free to travel incredible distances to meet with other Strigoi. These spirits would gather at the borders of the village, at crossroads, or in remote clearings, and there they would engage in great spectral battles. They fought one another with improvised weapons, spindles from a weaving loom, the blades of scythes, or simple wooden clubs. It was believed that the outcome of these ghostly wars would determine the fate of the entire village for the coming year. A good harvest or a famine, prosperity or ruin, all decided by a secret war fought by the sleeping souls of their neighbors, faced with this invisible threat living in their midst. A neighbor whose ill will could wither their crops or sicken their children. Those of old Romania were not helpless. They relied on a deep well of ancient folk magic and Christian faith to protect their homes and families.
A system of powerful apotropaics designed to ward off evil. The most famous of these known across the world was garlic. Its pungent smell and powerful properties were believed to be anathema to the Strigoi and other evil spirits. Villagers would hang braids of garlic on their doors, rub cloves of it on their window frames, and on the horns of their cattle, and even eat it to make their own bodies inhospitable to supernatural influence. It was the first line of defense in a constant unseen war. Other protections were also used. The sign of the cross, of course, was paramount, as was the smoke of sacred incense, believed to purify the air of malevolent spirits. People would place the thorny branches of the wild rose on their window sills, hoping to snag and trap a wandering spirit, or scatter millet seeds on their doorstep, relying on the old belief that a vampire would be compelled to stop and count every single grain, keeping it occupied until the safety of sunrise. This vigilance reached its peak on the night of St. Andrew, a time considered to be the night of the wolves, when the barriers between worlds were at their thinnest, and the Strigoi were at their most powerful. On this night, entire villages would effectively go into lockdown. Families would anoint every door, every window, and every chimney with garlic. They would turn all their pawn tools upside down so that the wandering spirits could not hide in them or use them. It was a night of great communal fear met with the strength of ancient ritual, but all these protections, the garlic, the cross, the rituals, were defenses against the living Strigoi and their wandering souls, were temporary measures designed to ward off a threat that was still bound, however loosely, to a physical mortal body. The true deep terror was reserved for what would happen when that body finally died and the spirit was set free from its last earthly prison.